Everyone was celebrating with their families, but he was alone, immersed in the emptiness of his own life. Until a simple letter from a child, asking for a father, touched his heart that had been closed for years. The girl's simple and pure request would change his life forever, bringing him love and
The
redemption.
warm Christmas Eve wind blew through the bustling streets of New York City, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts and the distant echo of the last street vendors hawking their wares. On the 25th floor of the most imposing office tower on Park Avenue, Edward Stanton stood motionless before his executive desk, his eyes fixed on spreadsheets he had already reviewed 3 times that afternoon. At 47, Edward had built an empire in real estate development. His skyscrapers dotted the Manhattan skyline like monuments to his success, but also to his loneliness. Each brick laid seemed to represent another. Today he had chosen work over any form of genuine human connection. His obsession with perfection and control had driven everyone away, leaving him with only employees who feared him and partners who respected him out of obligation. The office, decorated with imported furniture and expensive works of art, echoed the emptiness of his personal life. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city, illuminated by Christmas decorations, but Edward barely noticed them. To him, Christmas was just a commercial obstacle that delayed his construction schedules. He had lost the ability to see beauty in anything that wasn't a positive balance sheet. Edward had become a man methodical in his coldness. He woke up every day at 5 a.m., worked out in his private gym, showered in exactly 15 minutes, and dressed in suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary. His routine was as predictable as the movement of a Swiss watch, and this predictability was his way of maintaining absolute control over a life that, deep down, had become completely empty. His executive assistant, Mrs. Miller, a 60-year-old woman who had worked with him for a decade, had tried several times over the years to humanize him. She always left small gifts on his desk for holidays, talked about her grandchildren, and tried to include him in conversations about life beyond work. Edward tolerated her attempts with cold politeness, but never allowed her to cross the professional barrier he kept erected like a fortress. In truth, Mrs. Miller was the only person who still dared to treat him like a human being instead of just a boss. She had witnessed his transformation over the years, from an ambitious young entrepreneur who could still smile to the distant, calculating man he had become. Every now and then, she caught a glimpse of the man he had been before bitterness took over, but those moments were increasingly rare. That afternoon of December 24th, Mrs. Miller had left early, like all the other employees. Before leaving, she had placed a stack of mail that had arrived during the week on his desk. Edward had barely noticed, too focused on reviewing the contracts that needed to be finalized before the end of the year. There were 3 ongoing projects that would yield millions, but required his personal approval to proceed. The silence of the office was broken only by the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant noise of traffic below. Edward liked this silence. It was predictable, controllable, safe. There were no surprises, no disappointments, no possibility of being hurt by unmet expectations. When he finally stood up to pour himself another coffee, his eyes fell on the pile of letters. Most were business documents in letterhead envelopes, business proposals, financial reports, the kind of correspondence that dominated his life. But one envelope inexplicably caught his attention. It was small, yellowish, with the shaky, clumsy handwriting of a child. The address was written in purple crayon. And there were little drawings in the margins, lopsided stars, a disproportionate heart, and what looked like a little house with smoke coming out of the chimney. There was also a drawing of a Christmas tree next to his name, colored with green and brown, with small circles that probably represented ornaments. Edward hesitated before opening it. It was probably a disguised advertising campaign or a delivery error. Maybe a marketing stunt from some company trying to get attention with a cute approach. But something about the envelope intrigued him. Perhaps it was the simplicity of the drawings, or the way his name was written with such care, each letter formed slowly by a hand still learning to write. There was also something about the texture of the paper. It wasn't the glossy paper used in ad campaigns, but standard copy paper, slightly crumpled, as if it had been carried by an anxious child eager to mail it. The envelope had been sealed with Scotch tape applied unevenly, another sign that childish hands had prepared it. When he opened the letter, he found a sheet of plain copy paper with more colourful drawings scattered in the margins. There was a yellow sun in the top right corner, blue clouds scattered across the paper, and what looked like a family of stick figures drawn below the message. A tall figure, a medium one, and a tiny one, all holding hands. The message, written in the same childish handwriting, hit him like a punch to the gut. "Dear Santa Claus, my name is Sophia and I'm 4 years old. My mummy said you only bring presents to good kids, and I always try to be good. I don't want a doll or a toy this year. I just want a daddy for me and Mommy." Mommy cries a lot when she thinks I'm not looking, and I think it's because she has to take care of everything by herself. I promise to be even better if you bring a daddy who loves us, a daddy who hugs Mommy when she's sad and reads me stories before bed. Mommy works a lot and is always tired. I think a daddy could help her smile more. Please, Santa, can you find a daddy for us? I left a cookie for you and a carrot for the reindeer. Thank you. Love, Sophia. Edward read the letter 2-3 times. Each word seemed to cut through something inside him that had lain dormant for years. The simplicity of the request, the purity of the intention, the way the little girl was more concerned with her mother's happiness than with her own childish desires, all of it crumbled the defenses he had built around his heart. The impact of the letter was physical. Edward felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something was breaking inside. His hands trembled slightly as he held the paper, and for a moment he had to lean on the desk to keep his balance. It was as if those naive words had found a crack in his emotional armor and exploited it until it shattered completely. Memories he had buried deep within began to surface like inconvenient ghosts. He remembered when he was little, how he wrote similar letters, full of hope and innocence. He remembered his own mother, Beatrice, always working 2 jobs to support them after his father abandoned them when he was only 8. He remembered his own silent tears, the pleas he made every night for a father to appear and lift the weight from his mother's shoulders. Beatrice had been a strong woman, but Edward remembered perfectly how she would cry when she thought he wasn't looking, exactly as Sophia described her own mother. He remembered how his mother had aged prematurely, how her hands had become rough from excessive work, how she would force a smile when he asked why she was sad. The pain he had locked away spread through his chest like a wildfire. For decades, Edward had convinced himself that he didn't need anyone, that vulnerability was weakness, that love was a dangerous distraction. He had become the exact opposite of the father he himself had dreamed of, having distant, cold, focused only on power and money. He walked to the window, the letter still in his hands, watching the city move below. The people looked like ants from his height, each carrying their own pains and hopes. Outside, families walked the streets, carrying shopping bags, laughing, holding each other. Young couples pushed strollers, children ran between their parents' legs, elderly couples walked hand in hand with the complicity of decades together. The contrast between the life pulsing in the city and the emptiness of his office had never been so stark. For the first time in years, Edward felt truly alone, not just physically but emotionally isolated from any form of genuine love. His friends were business partners or people interested in his ventures. His romantic relationships were superficial and based on mutual interest, never on true affection. Sophia's letter had planted a seed of restlessness in his chest that grew with every second. How had a 4-year-old managed to express with such clarity something he had never been able to admit to himself? The desire to belong to a family, to be loved unconditionally, to have someone who cared about his well-being beyond his business dealings. Edward folded the letter carefully and put it in the inner pocket of his suit. For the first time in 20 years, he turned off his computer before 10 p.m. For the first time in decades, he felt he needed to do something that wasn't related to profit or power, something that might give some meaning to his empty existence. But even as he felt this strange urgency growing in his chest, Edward couldn't imagine that fulfilling the little girl's request would trigger a series of events that would shake every foundation he had built to protect himself from the pain of living. He didn't know that this innocent letter would become the catalyst for the greatest transformation of his life. As the elevator took him down to the underground parking garage, Edward was already planning how to find Sophia and her mother. What he didn't know was that this search would lead him to discover truths about himself that would forever change his understanding of what truly mattered in life. And that, in trying to give a child the father she wanted, he would discover that maybe there was still time for him to find the family he had always dreamed of having. The journey that began at that moment wouldn't just be about helping a child and her mother. It would be about Edward rediscovering the man he had been before choosing solitude as protection, before trading the possibility of love for the security of indifference. The next morning, Christmas Day, dawned grey and damp in New York. Edward had spent the entire night unable to sleep, Sophia's letter folded and refolded in his hands. For the first time in decades, there were no work plans occupying his mind. Instead, a single obsession had taken over his thoughts: finding the girl and her mother. At 7 a.m. he called Mrs. Miller, interrupting his assistant's Christmas breakfast. His voice sounded different, less controlled, almost anxious. He asked her to discreetly investigate the letter's address, to check with the post office, to do whatever was necessary to locate Sophia. Mrs. Miller, surprised by her boss's unusual urgency, agreed without asking questions, though her curiosity was palpable. 3 days later, Edward received the information he was looking for. Sophia Miller lived with her mother, Carla, 28, in a small apartment in Queens. The address led to a low-income housing complex, a world away from the mirrored towers and imported cars Edward knew. On Thursday afternoon, Edward drove his black Mercedes through the narrow streets of the neighborhood. The contrast with his usual routine was shocking. The simple houses, the small businesses, the children playing in the street. It all seemed to belong to a parallel universe. He parked in front of the 3-story building, observing the clothes hanging on the balconies and feeling completely out of place. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, his heart beating irregularly. When he rang the bell for apartment 22, he heard hurried footsteps and a child's high-pitched voice shouting, "Mummy, someone's at the door." Seconds later, the door opened, revealing a young woman with delicate features, but marked by exhaustion. Carla Miller had brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and was wearing a blue cleaning uniform. Her eyes, the same almond shade as her daughter's, immediately showed suspicion upon seeing the elegantly dressed man standing at her door. Edward, for the first time in years, felt genuinely nervous in front of another person. "Can I help you?" Carla asked, keeping the door only partially open, ready to slam it shut at any sign of danger. She had learned to distrust strangers, especially well-dressed men who showed up unannounced. Edward swallowed hard before answering, "My name is Edward Stanton. I received a letter from your daughter, a letter to Santa Claus." He pulled the crumpled envelope from his pocket, showing it to her. Carla's face instantly paled. She recognized her daughter's handwriting, the drawings made with crayons. "How did you get this? Sophia sent this letter to Santa Claus, not to you." Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and panic. "There was some mix-up at the post office," Edward lied, not wanting to complicate the situation further. "The letter came to me, and when I read it, I couldn't just ignore it." At that moment, Sophia appeared behind her mother, peeking at the stranger with curiosity. She was exactly as Edward had imagined, small with curly hair in 2 pigtails, wearing a simple but clean little dress. Her eyes shone with the innocence typical of a 4-year-old, but also with a precocious maturity that Edward recognized immediately, the same one he himself had developed too early. "Mummy, who is it?" Sophia asked, clutching her mother's skirt. Carla placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder, still staring at Edward with suspicion. "Sophia, go play in your room. Mummy needs to talk to this man." "But he brought my letter," Sophia exclaimed, recognizing the envelope. "Are you Santa Claus? You don't look like Santa Claus." Edward felt his heart clench. He knelt to the girl's level, ignoring the fact that his $3,000 suit was touching the dirty hallway floor. "No, little one, I'm not Santa Claus. But he asked me to bring your letter back. He said he needs to talk to your mummy about your request." Carla pulled Sophia back, her eyes flashing with anger. "Don't talk to my daughter, Sophia. Go to your room now." The girl reluctantly obeyed, but continued to peek through the ajar bedroom door. "Look," Carla said, her voice low but firm, "I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but it's not going to work on me. I have 2 jobs, I work 16 hours a day, and the last thing I need is some creep showing up at my door pretending to be interested in my daughter." Edward felt each word like a blow. He realized how strange, even threatening, his approach must have seemed. "I understand your suspicion," he said, standing up slowly, "but I'm not here to harm you. I read Sophia's letter and it touched me in a way I didn't expect." "And what exactly do you want?" Carla crossed her arms, remaining on the defensive. Edward hesitated. He had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but now, faced with the raw reality of this family's situation, his words felt inadequate. "I want to help. Sophia asked for a father, and I'd like to offer what I can." Carla's bitter laugh echoed down the hall. "You want to offer what? Are you offering to be our stand-in dad? That's ridiculous. You don't know me, you don't know my daughter. You just show up here out of nowhere thinking you can fix our lives with money." "It's not about money," Edward replied, but his voice sounded unsure even to himself. "No? Then what is it? You think we're a charity project? Some kind of family for hire to satisfy your guilty conscience?" Carla was visibly angry now. "My daughter may be little, but she's not stupid. She doesn't need someone pretending to care about her just to feel better about himself." Carla's words hit Edward hard. She had verbalized the exact fears he didn't want to admit, that his intentions were selfish, that he was using their situation to fill the void in his own life. But even so, he couldn't just walk away. "You're right," he said finally. "I don't know you, and maybe my intentions aren't as pure as I'd like to believe. But your daughter's letter made me realize something about myself. I've spent 30 years building walls around me, convincing myself I didn't need anyone. And now I'm here in front of a child who has the courage to ask for what I never even had the courage to admit I wanted." Carla studied him in silence for a long moment. There was something in his vulnerability that made her lower her guard slightly, though she remained suspicious. "Listen," she said, her voice a little softer. "I appreciate you coming to return the letter, but Sophia is all I have in this world. I can't let strangers come into our lives and then disappear when the novelty wears off. She's already suffered enough." Edward noticed the underlying pain in her voice and wondered what kind of suffering Sophia had already experienced in her few years of life. "What if I promised I won't disappear? What if I promised that, if you give me a chance, I'll be here for as long as you want me to be?" "Promises are easy to make," Carla replied, "especially for rich people who can buy their way out of any situation." At that moment, Sophia reappeared at the bedroom door, carrying a worn-out teddy bear. "Mommy, why are you fighting? Did the man come because of my letter?" Carla sighed, looking at her daughter with a mixture of tenderness and concern. "Sophia, honey, go back to your room. Mommy will be right there." But Sophia approached Edward, looking at him with curiosity. "You said Santa sent you. Does that mean he read my letter? Is he going to send us a daddy?" Edward felt a lump in his throat. The hope in Sophia's eyes was both beautiful and devastating. How could he explain to a 4-year-old that the real world was much more complicated than Christmas magic? And how could he look at that hope and simply walk away? "I can't promise anything," he said, kneeling again to be at her level. "But I can promise that I'll try to be the best friend I can be to you and your mommy." Sophia smiled, a smile so radiant that Edward felt something definitively break inside him. But when he looked at Carla, he saw that she had hardened again, her arms crossed in a defensive posture that made it clear the conversation was over. "Sophia, say goodbye to the man," Carla said firmly. "He needs to leave now." As Edward walked down the stairs, he heard the door close behind him with a finality that echoed like a sentence. He had found Sophia and Carla, but now he realized that finding them had been the easy part. Convincing a hurt and suspicious mother to accept his help would be a much greater challenge than he had imagined. And as he drove back to his world of privilege, Edward couldn't stop thinking about Sophia's smile and the pain hidden in Carla's eyes, knowing he had awakened something within himself that would have no peace until he made a difference in their lives. For the next 2 weeks, Edward couldn't get Sophia and Carla out of his mind. Every business meeting seemed irrelevant. Every financial report lost its meaning in the face of the memory of that radiant smile and the justified suspicion in the mother's eyes. He had tried to return to his normal routine, but found that something fundamental had changed within him since that afternoon in Queens. Mrs. Miller noticed the change immediately. Edward was distracted, often staring out the window, and for the first time in a decade, he had asked about her family over coffee. The assistant, with her sharp maternal intuition, knew that something was deeply affecting her boss, but she respected his silence. On Wednesday, of the second week of January, Edward made a decision. Instead of trying a direct approach again, he would get to know Carla's reality better before making another move. He asked a private investigator, Charles Mendoza, to discreetly look into the family's situation, emphasizing that he wanted nothing invasive or that could harm them in any way. The results of the investigation arrived 3 days later and were more devastating than Edward had imagined. Carla Miller worked as a cleaner at a public hospital during the day and cleaned offices overnight. Sophia was cared for by Mrs. Rose, a 70-year-old neighbor who looked after several children in the building for a symbolic fee. Carla's monthly income barely covered rent, basic utilities and food. But what shook Edward the most were the details about Carla's past. She had gotten pregnant at 23 by a man who abandoned her as soon as he found out. During her pregnancy, she was fired from her previous job due to staff cuts. But Edward suspected the real reason was prejudice. Carla had faced the pregnancy alone, working until the last month to pay for medical expenses. The report also revealed that Sophia had been born prematurely, spending 3 weeks in the NICU. The medical debt still weighed on Carla, who paid monthly installments that took up almost a third of her income. During Sophia's first year, Carla had developed postpartum depression, but couldn't afford proper treatment, relying only on Mrs. Rose's support and her own willpower to get through the toughest times. Edward closed the report with trembling hands. Carla's strength was admirable, but it also revealed a profound isolation he recognized in himself. She had learned to rely only on herself, to distrust outside help, to protect Sophia with the ferocity of someone who knew no one else would do it for them. Determined to try a different approach, Edward began to discreetly frequent the neighborhood where they lived, not to stalk them, but to better understand their world. He bought bread at the corner bakery, had coffee at the diner across from their building, and observed the community's dynamics. Gradually, he began to realize that this place, despite its financial hardships, had something his world of luxury lacked: genuine human connections. It was at the bakery that Edward met Mr. Johnson, the owner for 20 years, who spoke of Carla with evident affection. "She's a real gem, that Carla," he said while wrapping the pastry Edward had ordered. "Works like a horse, never complains, always polite. And Sophia is a sweetheart, cheerful, well-behaved. It's a shame life isn't easier for people like them." "What do you mean?" Edward asked, feigning casual curiosity. Mr. Johnson shook his head. "The poor girl barely has time to be a mother. She works so much she hardly sees her daughter awake. Sophia spends more time with Mrs. Rose than with her own mom. And let me tell you, Carla does the impossible. I've seen her come in, here to buy a roll for Sophia on a day when she didn't even have enough for herself." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. Carla's dedication touched something deep in his own childhood memories. His mother had made similar sacrifices, depriving herself of basic needs to ensure he had the minimum necessary. "She never accepts help," Mr. Johnson continued. "I've offered to let her run a tab several times, but she insists on paying for everything up front, even when I know she's counting pennies. Too proud, maybe, or too hurt by people who promised to help and then disappeared." That night, Edward had a different kind of insomnia. For the first time, he wasn't obsessed with business strategies or plans. He was thinking about the shared loneliness between him and Carla, two people who had learned to protect themselves by building walls, two people who had chosen independence as a way to avoid the pain of disappointment. The next morning, Edward made a decision that surprised even Mrs. Miller. He cancelled all his meetings for the day and drove back to Queens. But this time he didn't go straight to Carla's apartment. He stopped at the bakery first, bought some groceries and asked Mr. Johnson to deliver a bag of food to Carla, saying it was a promotion from the store for special customers. Mr. Johnson looked at him suspiciously. "A promotion? Son, I've been working here for 20 years and I've never had a promotion." Edward sighed. "All right. The truth is I'd like to help Carla and Sophia, but she won't accept direct help. I thought maybe, coming from someone she knows—" "You're that man who showed up here last week." Mr. Johnson studied him carefully. "What do you want with Carla?" "Nothing that would harm her," Edward answered, honestly. "I received a letter from her daughter by mistake, and it affected me. I just want to help, but she's right to be suspicious of strangers." Mr. Johnson was silent for a long moment, sizing Edward up. "Carla's been through a lot. Men who promise the world and disappear when things get tough. She learned to be suspicious out of necessity, not choice." "I understand," Edward said, "and that's why I want to earn her trust gradually, without pressure." "If you're thinking of hurting that girl or Sophia," Mr. Johnson said with a threatening tone that contrasted with his peaceful appearance. "I'm not," Edward interrupted him. "Quite the opposite. I want to help, but in the right way." After a delicate negotiation, Mr. Johnson agreed to deliver the grocery bag, but with one condition. Edward would have to explain his intentions to Carla in person at some point. "I'm not going to lie to her for long," the baker warned. Later that afternoon, Edward watched from a distance as Mr. Johnson delivered the groceries to Carla. He saw the confusion on her face, the hesitation, and finally the reluctant acceptance. Sophia appeared at the door, jumping with joy at the sight of some cookies and juices that were normally beyond their family budget. In the following days, Edward repeated the gesture through different people in the neighborhood. The butcher won a few extra pounds of meat to distribute, the pharmacy had a special promotion on children's vitamins, and the clothing store offered an exclusive discount on winter coats for kids. Carla began to suspect something was up when the coincidences became too frequent. Her natural suspicion alerted her to the strange pattern of good luck that was happening just when she needed it most. It was Mrs. Rose who finally confirmed her suspicions. The neighbor had seen Edward talking to Mr. Johnson, and with her characteristic curiosity, had discovered the truth. When she told Carla, the reaction was explosive. "He's spying on me," Carla exclaimed, her voice trembling with anger and humiliation, "making everyone in the neighborhood act like I'm some beggar who needs a handout." "Calm down, dear," Mrs. Rose tried to soothe her. "The man doesn't seem to have bad intentions. Maybe he's just trying to help. Help by lying to me, making everyone conspire behind my back." Carla was visibly shaken. "I work 16 hours a day to provide a dignified life for my daughter, and he comes here and turns it into disguised charity." The humiliation Carla felt was as intense as her anger. She had spent years fighting to keep her head held high, to prove she could take care of Sophia without depending on anyone. And now she discovered that half the neighborhood knew about her financial situation and was participating in a scheme of disguised aid. That night, Carla knocked on Edward's door with Sophia asleep in her arms. When he opened the door to his luxurious Upper East Side apartment, he found a woman transfigured by fury, her eyes red from tears she refused to let fall. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past him without ceremony. "Now." Edward's Upper East Side apartment perfectly reflected his personality, impeccable, cold, and devoid of any personal touch. Italian designer furniture, abstract art, and a privileged view of the city created an environment that impressed visitors, but welcomed no one. Carla entered carrying a sleeping Sophia, her eyes scanning the room with a mixture of discomfort and restrained anger. "Put her on the couch," Edward said, his voice low so as not to wake the girl. He watched Carla carefully place Sophia on the white leather sofa, adjusting her daughter's little legs and pulling her jacket over her for warmth. Even in her fury, her maternal instinct was evident in every delicate gesture. When Carla turned to face him, Edward saw that her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from an anger so intense she was struggling to contain it. Her eyes, normally sweet, shone with a hardness he hadn't seen before. "Do you think I'm stupid?" she began, her voice a venomous whisper. "You think I wouldn't notice that every week a different promotion popped up just when I needed it most? That all the shopkeepers in the neighborhood suddenly had lucky leftover stock to offer me?" Edward ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his nervousness. "Carla, I just wanted to help." "By lying to me," she cut him off, taking a step forward. "Making everyone in the neighborhood conspire behind my back, turning me into an object of pity. Do you have any idea how I felt when Mrs. Rose told me you were paying for everything?" "You were struggling," Edward tried to justify himself. Sophia needs a mother with dignity," Carla exploded, her voice rising before she remembered her sleeping daughter and lowered it back to a whisper. "She needs a mother who can support her own family without disguised handouts from strangers." Edward felt each word like a physical blow. "It wasn't a handout, it was what? Charity. You feeling better about yourself at my expense?" Carla crossed her arms, her posture defensive, but also vulnerable. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. You don't know how I've fought to get where I am." "Then, tell me," Edward said, his own voice filled with emotion. "Explain to me why it's so hard to accept help from someone who genuinely cares." Carla laughed bitterly. "Cares? You've been in my life for 2 weeks. What kind of person cares about strangers enough to stalk, investigate, and manipulate their lives?" The accusation hit Edward hard because there was truth in it. His obsession with helping Carla and Sophia had crossed lines he didn't want to admit. "You're right," he said finally. "I overstepped. But when I read Sophia's letter is not a license for you to interfere in our lives," Carla interrupted him again. "She's a child. She doesn't understand the consequences of what she writes. But I do. I know that accepting your help means being indebted to you. It means depending on someone who can disappear from our lives when he gets tired of the novelty." Edward realized he was facing something much bigger than wounded pride. Carla was terrified of becoming dependent, of trusting, of allowing herself to believe that someone could really be there for them without ulterior motives. "How many times have you been abandoned?" he asked softly, completely changing the tone of the conversation. The question caught Carla off guard. Her defenses wavered for a moment, revealing the deep pain she carried. "That's none of your business." "Sophia's father disappeared in the 2nd month of pregnancy," Carla answered automatically, then seemed to regret sharing the information. "He promised we'd be a family, that he'd take care of us. He vanished when he realized having a family was work." Edward nodded, recognizing the pattern. "Your parents?" "My father left us when I was 12. My mother passed away when Sophia was 6 months old." Carla's voice grew quieter, heavy with old pain. "It's always been just me and Sophia, always." "And you learned you can't trust anyone," Edward finished. "I learned that people make promises they can't keep," Carla corrected. "I learned that the more you need someone, the more likely they are to abandon you when things get tough." Edward walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "My father left me when I was 8, said he was going out for cigarettes and never came back. My mother worked 3 jobs to support me until I got a scholarship." Carla watched him in silence, surprised by the revelation. "She passed away when I was 22, Edward continued. "Cancer. She didn't have health insurance, couldn't afford private treatment. I was a college student working part-time. I couldn't help. She died thinking she had failed me." "You didn't fail her," Carla said instinctively, her anger momentarily replaced by compassion. Edward turned to face her. "You're not failing Sophia either. You're giving her something I never had and you never had, a present, dedicated mother who fights for her every single day." "But it's not enough," Carla whispered, her defenses starting to crumble. "I work so much I barely have time with her. When I get home I'm so exhausted I can sometimes barely read her a story before she falls asleep. She spends more time with Mrs. Rose than with me." "You're doing what you can with what you have," Edward said, approaching her slowly. "But what if you didn't have to do it alone?" "I can't depend on you," Carla replied, but her voice had lost its earlier harshness. I can't create expectations in Sophia that you'll always be here. I can't what? I can't let myself believe that someone like you really cares about someone. Like me, she admitted, the words coming out like a painful confession. Edward felt his heart ache. Why not? Because you're rich, successful, you live in an apartment that costs more than I make in 10 years. Because men like you aren't genuinely interested in women like me except out of pity or to satisfy some savior complex. And what if I told you it's not pity or a savior complex? Edward asked, stopping a few feet from her. What if I told you that Sophia's letter made me realize I'm just as lonely as you are, that I've spent 20 years building an empty, profitable life, but never a life worth living? Carla studied him, searching for signs of a lie in his eyes. What do you want from us? I want a chance to prove that not all men leave, that not all promises are empty. I want to try to be part of something bigger than profit and power. And when you get tired, when you realize that having a family is work, commitment, giving things up, then you send me away, Edward answered simply. But give me a chance to try, a real honest, a chance without lies or manipulation. Carla looked at Sophia sleeping on the couch, her little features relaxed in peace. The girl had whispered a few times in her sleep about the letter man and when Daddy is coming. Carla knew that, regardless of her own reservations, Sophia had already formed an expectation. Sophia is already attached to you, she said finally. If you disappear now, it will hurt her. I won't disappear, Edward promised. How can I be sure? Edward hesitated, searching for words that could convey the sincerity he felt. Because for the first time in 20 years, I have a reason to wake up in the morning that isn't work. Because looking at Sophia reminds me of who I was before I became this cold, calculating person. And because looking at you makes me want to be the man I should have become. Carla felt tears burn her eyes, but she fought to hold them back. You barely know me. Then let me get to know you, Edward pleaded. Let me try to make a difference in your lives, not as a savior or a benefactor, but as someone who genuinely cares. At that moment, Sophia stirred on the couch, whispering in her sleep. Mommy, did Daddy come? Carla and Edward looked at each other, the weight of the child's words hanging between them like an unspoken promise and an imminent danger. Carla discreetly wiped away a tear that had escaped. If I give you this chance, if I let you try to be part of our lives, do you promise that if one day you can't do it anymore, you'll talk to me before just disappearing? I promise, Edward answered without hesitation. And do you promise you won't try to change who we are, won't try to turn us into your ideal version of a family? I promise. Carla took a deep breath, as if preparing to jump off a cliff. One chance, she said finally, but with clear rules, no lies, no manipulation. And the first time Sophia cries because of you, it's over. Edward nodded, feeling a mix of relief and terror. He had gotten the chance he wanted, but now he would have to prove he was worthy of it. And as he watched Carla gather a sleeping Sophia into her arms to take her back home, Edward realized he had just taken on the most important responsibility of his life, caring for the hearts of two people who had already been hurt too much. The 2 weeks that followed the confrontation in Edward's apartment were a delicate balancing act. He had promised total honesty, and he kept that promise almost obsessively, asking permission before any gesture, explaining every intention before acting. Carla watched his every move with the caution of someone who had been betrayed many times before. Edward started by visiting them on Saturday afternoons, always bringing something simple, fruit from the market, a children's book, some sweets that Sophia loved. Nothing extravagant that could make Carla feel indebted. He quickly learned that grand gestures scared her, while small attentions were accepted reluctantly, but accepted nonetheless. Sophia, on the other hand, welcomed Edward with the naturalness typical of children. To her, he was simply the man Santa sent, and that was enough for her to trust him completely. She asked him to read stories, showed him her drawings, and told him about her days with the spontaneity only a 4-year-old possesses. Uncle Edward, why don't you have a kid's bed at your house? Sophia asked during one of his visits, as they played with building blocks on the small living room floor. Edward glanced at Carla, who was preparing a snack in the kitchen, trying to pretend she wasn't listening to the conversation. "Because I live alone, sweetie. I don't have any children." "But you can have us," Sophia said with the devastating simplicity of childhood. "Mummy said you want to be our family. Families live together, right?" Edward felt his stomach tighten. Sophia's pure logic exposed issues that neither he nor Carla were ready to face. "Sometimes families live in different houses," he explained carefully. "But that's boring," Sophia pouted. "I wish you lived here, or that we lived at your nice house with that big couch." From the kitchen, Edward heard Carla let out a heavy sigh. He knew these conversations made her uncomfortable, but Sophia was a smart child who asked tough questions. How could he explain to her that adults had complications children didn't understand? "Sophia," Carla called, appearing at the kitchen doorway. "How about you help Mommy set the table for our snack?" The girl obeyed, but Edward noticed the tension on Carla's face. Later, when Sophia was watching cartoons, he brought up the subject. "She's developing expectations that I might not be able to meet," he said, keeping his voice low. "I know," Carla replied, nervously arranging some objects on the table. "She's 4. To her, if you come here every Saturday, play with her, act like a father, then you are a father." "And that scares you," Edward observed. "It terrifies me," she admitted, "because if you decide this is too complicated, if you get tired of this routine, she won't understand why Daddy left. She'll think it was her fault." Edward felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. "Carla, I'm not going to— Don't make promises you might not be able to keep," she cut him off. "Just be careful with her heart. It's all I have in this world." The following Monday, Edward received a call that would change everything. It was Carla on the phone, her voice broken by restrained sobs. "Edward, can you come to St. Luke's Hospital? I need help." Edward cancelled all his meetings for the day and rushed to the hospital where Carla worked. He found her sitting on a bench outside the administrative building. Her uniform wrinkled, her eyes red from crying. Sophia was beside her, quiet and scared, holding tightly to her mother's hand. "What happened?" Edward asked, kneeling in front of them. "They fired me," Carla said, her voice a broken whisper. "They said there was an anonymous complaint, that I was stealing cleaning supplies." Edward felt anger rise like lava in his chest. "That's a lie." "It is," Carla confirmed, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "But the supervisor said they can't take any chances, that my record isn't clean." "What record?" "5 years ago, when Sophia was a baby, I took some disposable diapers from the hospital where I worked. Sophia had a terrible rash and I didn't have money for special diapers. They made me return them when they found out, but it went on my record." Edward immediately understood the situation. Someone had discovered this old incident and used it to harm Carla. "Who made the complaint?" "I don't know. It's anonymous." Carla looked at Sophia, who was clearly confused and frightened by the whole situation. "It's going to be okay, sweetie. Mummy will find another job." But Edward saw the panic in Carla's eyes. Without the hospital job, she would depend solely on her night work, which alone didn't even cover half of their expenses. And getting another job with a for-cause termination would be nearly impossible. "Let me help," Edward said, but Carla immediately shook her head. "No, I'm not going to let this situation make me dependent. I'll manage on my own, like I always have." "Carla, be practical. You have Sophia to take care of." "That's exactly why I can't accept your help now," she exploded, then looked around, remembering they were in public. "Don't you get it? If I accept your financial help now, I'll never be able to get out of this dependency. I'll become what you always thought I was, a woman who needs to be supported by a rich man." Edward realized they were at an impasse. Carla was too proud to accept help, but also too proud to break down. And in the meantime, Sophia was in the middle, a child who didn't understand why her mommy was crying and why she had to leave her job. "Uncle Edward," Sophia tugged on his shirt sleeve, "is Mommy sad because she lost her job?" Edward looked at Carla, silently asking for permission to answer. She nodded reluctantly. Yes, sweetie, but your mommy is very smart and strong. She'll find a new job. And in the meantime, Sophia asked with the relentless logic of childhood, how are we going to buy food? The question hit Carla like a physical blow. Edward saw her defenses crumble for a moment, revealing the pure terror of a mother who didn't know how she was going to feed her child the next day. Sophia, go play on that swing set for a minute, Carla asked, pointing to a small nearby playground. Mommy needs to talk to Uncle. Edward. When Sophia moved away, Carla turned to Edward with tears streaming freely. I have $300 in my account. Rent is due in a week. Without the hospital salary, I won't be able to pay it. I'll have to move back to my aunt's house in the Bronx, Carla continued, ignoring his offer. It's the only option. She has a room in the back she can lend us for a while. Edward knew the Bronx. It was even farther, even poorer than Queens. And Sophia? Her school? She'll have to switch, start all over. Carla wiped, her face angry at herself for crying in front of him. She'll lose her friends, Mrs. Rose, everything she knows. Carla, please be reasonable. Reasonable would be accepting your money and becoming your dependent. Reasonable would be teaching Sophia that women need rich men to survive. Carla stood up, her pain turning back into anger. I may be poor, but I have dignity. Edward stood up too, frustrated. Dignity doesn't pay the rent. Maybe not, but it's all I have to leave for my daughter, Carla retorted. The lesson that she should never depend on anyone to survive. At that moment, Sophia came running back, sensing the tension between the adults. Are you guys fighting? She asked, her little lip trembling. Edward and Carla looked at each other, both realizing how their arguments were affecting the child. No, sweetie, Carla said, crouching to be at her daughter's level. We're not fighting, just talking about changes. What changes? Carla hesitated, searching for words to explain a situation she couldn't fully process herself. Edward watched the mother and daughter, feeling completely helpless. He had promised to be there for them, but how could he help when his help was rejected? How could he protect Sophia when Carla refused to be protected? And more importantly, how could he prove he wasn't like all the other men who had abandoned Carla when things got tough, if she wouldn't let him stand by her side in tough times? As he watched Carla try to explain to Sophia that they might have to move far away, Edward made a decision that would change everything for the three of them. A decision that would test not only his word, but the true depth of his commitment to this unlikely family he had found through a Christmas letter. The decision Edward made in that desperate moment was both the most generous and the most selfish of his life. 3 days after Carla's dismissal, he showed up at her apartment door with a proposal that would change everything. I bought the building, he announced bluntly, as Carla opened the door still in her pajamas, clearly having just woken up after another sleepless night searching for jobs online. Carla blinked several times, trying to process his words. You did what? I bought the building you live in, and all the other buildings on this block, Edward repeated, walking in uninvited. I'm now officially the landlord, and as the landlord I'm offering you the position of property manager. Salary of $3,000 a month, plus benefits. The silence that followed was deafening. Carla stared at him as if he had completely lost his mind. Sophia, who was having breakfast at the kitchen table, shouted happily, Uncle Edward, did you come have breakfast with us? In a minute, sweetie, Edward replied, without taking his eyes off Carla. I need to finish talking to your mommy. Carla closed the door slowly, her hands trembling with an emotion Edward couldn't identify. Anger, shock, panic. You're insane, she said finally, her voice dangerously low, completely insane. It's a practical solution, Edward defended himself. You need a job. I need someone trustworthy to manage the properties. It's a legitimate business. A legitimate business, Carla repeated, her voice rising. You bought an entire city block to give me a job, and you call that a legitimate business. Technically, it's a solid investment. Real estate in this area is appreciating. Stop! Carla shouted, then lowered her voice, remembering Sophia in the kitchen. Just stop this charade. You spent millions of dollars to solve my unemployment problem. This isn't normal, Edward. This is an obsession. Edward felt as if he'd been punched. I just wanted to help. Help? You've practically kidnapped me. Carla began pacing the small living room, gesturing nervously. Now I can't even move out if I want to, because you own everything. How is that helping? You won't have to move, Edward tried to argue. Sophia can stay in the same school. You can stay in the apartment. As your eternal tenants, Carla interrupted, dependent on your goodwill? What if one day you get tired of playing family? What if you decide you don't want to be our benefactor anymore? What happens to us then? Edward realized too late how his solution had created an even bigger problem. In his eagerness to protect Carla and Sophia, he had created a gilded cage from which they couldn't escape. I won't get tired, he said, but his voice sounded uncertain even to himself. You can't promise that, Carla retorted. No one can. And now you have so much power over our lives that we have no choice but to trust you blindly. At that moment, Sophia appeared at the living room door, carrying her favorite doll. Why? Is Mommy yelling? She asked, looking between the two adults with concern. Edward knelt to her level, forcing a smile. Your Mommy isn't yelling, sweetie. We're just talking about work. Is Mommy going to work here at home now? Sophia asked, excited. Does that mean you'll always be here too? The innocent question hit Edward and Carla like a bomb. Sophia had created an expectation neither of them had considered. To a 4-year-old, if Mommy worked for Uncle Edward and he owned the building, it meant they were a real family. It's not quite like that, honey, Carla tried to explain, but her voice trembled. But is Uncle Edward our boss now? Sophia insisted. At school, Julia said her Mommy's boss lives at their house, and they're married. Edward saw Carla turn completely pale. The situation had escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. Sophia, how about you go play in your room while Mommy and Uncle Edward finish talking? Carla suggested, clearly struggling to stay calm. When Sophia left, Carla turned to Edward with an expression of pure desperation. Do you see what you've done? Now she thinks we're a real family, that you're going to live here, that we're going to be like her friends' parents. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Edward said hesitantly. Not so bad, Carla repeated, incredulous. Edward, you've known Sophia for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And now she thinks you're her father. What if I was? Edward asked impulsively, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Carla stared at him as if he were a stranger. What? What if I was her father? What if we were a real family? Edward continued, realizing he was venturing into dangerous territory but unable to stop. I can give you stability, security, love. Love? Carla interrupted, her voice sharp with disbelief. Edward, you're in love with a fantasy, with a romantic idea of being a savior, not with me. You barely know me. I know enough to know that you're strong, determined, and incredible mother. You know my resume, Carla exploded again. You know I'm 28, that I work hard, that I fight to support my daughter. But you don't know that I hate coffee, that I have nightmares every night about being alone in the world, that I'm terrified of thunderstorms because they remind me of the night my mother died. Edward fell silent, realizing she was right. He had fallen in love with the idea of having a family, not necessarily with Carla as a person. You don't love me, Carla continued, tears streaming down her face. You love the possibility of not being alone anymore. And I can't build a life on someone else's loneliness. So what do you want me to do? Edward asked, feeling lost. Sell everything? Disappear from your lives? Let Sophia think another father has abandoned her? I don't know, Carla shouted, then controlled herself again. I don't know what I want you to do. I just know this is happening too fast, it's too intense, and I can't process it. Edward sat on the couch, running his hands through his hair. I screwed everything up, didn't I? You complicated everything, Carla corrected, sitting in the armchair across from him. You turned an already difficult situation into something almost impossible to navigate. They sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Sophia who broke the silence, appearing in the living room again. Uncle Edward, are you leaving? She asked, her small voice filled with anxiety. Edward looked at Carla, seeking guidance. She closed her eyes, clearly emotionally exhausted. I don't know, sweetie, Edward answered honestly. Your mommy and I are trying to decide some important things. Is it about me? Sophia asked, with the frightening intuition of children. It's about all of us, Carla replied, scooping her daughter into her lap, about how we can be happy without hurting anyone. But I'm already happy, Sophia said, hugging her mother. I have you and Uncle Edward. That's a family, isn't it? Edward felt his heart ache painfully. How could you explain to a child that adults manage to complicate even the simplest things? Just then, Carla's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but she answered anyway. Hello? Edward watched her face change completely during the conversation. First confusion, then shock, then something that looked like pure terror. Yes, I understand. Yes, I'll be there, she said, hanging up with trembling hands. What is it? Edward asked, alarmed by Carla's sudden pallor. That was Child Protective Services, Carla said, her voice a broken whisper. Someone filed a complaint. They said Sophia is living in an at-risk situation, that I'm involved with unknown men, that I'm not financially stable enough to care for her. Edward felt the floor drop out from under him. That's ridiculous. We'll explain. They're coming here tomorrow for an evaluation, Carla continued, as if she hadn't heard him. And if they're not satisfied with what they find... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Edward immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Someone was using his presence in their lives against them. And now Sophia was at risk of being separated from Carla because of him. "Mommy," Sophia asked, sensing the tension in the air, "why are you crying?" Carla hugged her daughter, tightly, as if someone might tear her from her arms at any moment. And maybe, Edward realized with growing horror, someone really could. The night before the visit from Child Protective Services was the longest of Carla's life. She spent hours meticulously cleaning every corner of the apartment, organizing documents, and rehearsing answers to questions she didn't even know would be asked. Edward had offered to hire a lawyer, but she refused, fearing it would look like an attempt to intimidate the social workers. Sophia, sensing the tension in the air, was unusually quiet all morning. She put on her prettiest dress without complaining, and tidied up all her toys without being asked. Her childish intuition warned her that something very serious was happening, even if she didn't understand exactly what. At 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. Carla took a deep breath before opening the door to two middle-aged women in business attire, carrying clipboards. The taller one, who introduced herself as Ms. Fernandez, had a stern look that immediately made Carla uncomfortable. The other, Ms. Marshall, seemed kinder, but her eyes observed every detail with professional scrutiny. "Good afternoon, Ms. Miller. We're from Child Protective Services. We received a report concerning the welfare of the minor, Sophia Miller," Ms. Fernandez said, consulting her papers. "May we come in?" "Of course, please," Carla replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The social workers entered and began a silent inspection of the apartment. Carla watched their eyes scan every piece of furniture, open the refrigerator, check cleaning supplies, and examine Sophia's room. Every second felt like an eternity. Sophia appeared shyly behind her mother, hugging her favorite doll. Ms. Marshall knelt to her level with a maternal smile. "Hi, Sophia. My name is Ms. Marshall. Can we talk for a little bit?" Sophia looked to Carla for approval. When her mother nodded, she answered in a small voice, "Hi. Do you like living here with your mummy?" "I do. Mommy takes good care of me," Sophia replied, instinctively protective. Ms. Fernandez jotted something on her clipboard. "Sophia, does your mummy have friends who come to visit?" "There's Uncle Edward," Sophia said, her face lighting up. "He's really nice. He reads me stories and brings me cookies." The social workers exchanged glances. "Does this Uncle Edward live here?" Ms. Fernandez asked. "No, but I wish he did," Sophia answered honestly. "Then we'd be a real family." Carla felt her stomach sink. Sophia's innocence was inadvertently confirming exactly what the report had suggested. "Sophia, honey, how about you show the ladies your drawings?" Carla intervened quickly. For the next hour, the social workers asked detailed questions about Sophia's routine, her diet, medical care, and education. Carla answered each question precisely, showing vaccination records, school reports, and doctor's visit receipts that she kept organized in a folder. "How many hours a day do you work?" Ms. Fernandez asked. "I'm currently unemployed," Carla admitted, "but I've secured a new position as a property manager. I'll be working 8 hours a day." And who takes care of Sophia while you're at work? Mrs. Rose, our neighbor. She's been looking after Sophia for 4 years. And this Mr. Stanton, the child mentioned, what exactly is the nature of your relationship with him? Carla hesitated, choosing her words carefully. He's a family friend, someone we trust. A friend who, according to our information, recently purchased this entire city block? Ms. Fernandez pressed, consulting her papers. Carla realized that whoever had filed the report knew a lot about their situation. Yes, he offered me the property manager job. Don't. You find it strange that a man you've known for a short time would make million-dollar investments to benefit you. Carla didn't know how to answer without making the situation seem even worse. Mommy, Sophia interrupted, tugging on Carla's skirt. Can I go play outside with Maria? Not right now, sweetie. The ladies are still talking with us. Ms. Marshall leaned toward Sophia again. Sophia, has Uncle Edward ever slept over here? Sophia thought for a moment. No. He always leaves before Mommy puts me to bed, but I've asked him to stay. More notes were taken. Carla felt as if she were being slowly dissected. Ms. Miller, Ms. Fernandez said, the report suggests you are exposing the minor to unknown men and that your financial situation is unstable. From what we've observed, Sophia appears well cared for, but the circumstances of your relationship with this Mr. Stanton are peculiar. Peculiar how? Carla asked, trying to maintain her dignity. A wealthy man who appears in the life of a woman in financial distress, offers excessive help, and develops a close relationship with the child. It's a pattern we see with some frequency, and not always with good intentions. The words hit Carla like slaps. She realized how the situation looked from an outside perspective. A desperate single mother, a wealthy man with questionable motives, a vulnerable child in the middle. It's not like that, Carla said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. We will need to speak with this Mr. Stanton, Ms. Fernandez announced, and during our investigation, we will consider whether closer monitoring of the situation is necessary. After the social workers left, promising to return the following week, Carla collapsed onto the couch, trembling uncontrollably. Sophia approached and climbed into her lap, hugging her tightly. Mummy, why are you sad? The ladies left. Carla hugged her daughter, feeling tears burn her eyes. How could she explain to a 4-year-old that his presence in their lives was threatening to tear them apart? Edward arrived an hour later, finding Carla still on the couch, Sophia asleep in her arms. How did it go? He asked, but the expression on her face already answered his question. Terrible, Carla whispered. They're coming back next week to talk to you, and depending on what they decide, what can I do to help? Leave, Carla answered without hesitation. Get out of our lives before it's too late. Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Carla, don't you get it? Your presence is putting Sophia at risk. They think you have questionable motives, that I'm a negligent mother who exposes my daughter to strangers. But that's not true. It doesn't matter what's true, Carla exploded, then lowered her voice so as not to wake Sophia. It matters what it looks like. And it looks like I'm a desperate woman who sold her daughter's safety for financial stability. Edward sat beside her, watching Sophia sleep. There's another solution. What? We get married. Carla stared at him as if he had completely lost his mind. What? If we're married, you'll no longer be a vulnerable single mother. You'll be a wife with family and financial stability. Edward, you're talking about marriage as if it's a business contract. Maybe that's exactly what it is, he said, his voice gaining conviction. A contract to protect Sophia, to give her the security the social workers want to see. And you? You'd marry me just to solve a bureaucratic problem? Edward looked her directly in the eyes. I would marry you because I love you both, because I can't imagine my life without you, because Sophia already calls me Dad in her heart, even if she doesn't use the words. Carla felt tears roll down her face. This is crazy. Maybe, but it's the only way to make sure you two stay together. And what if it goes wrong? What if we can't make it work? What if you realize you made a mistake? What if it goes right? Edward countered. What if we discover we're better together than apart? What if Sophia finally gets the family she's always dreamed of? At that moment, Sophia stirred in Carla's lap, murmuring something in her sleep. Edward leaned in to hear better, and their hearts clenched when she whispered, "Daddy, don't go." Carla and Edward looked at each other, both realizing this was no longer just about them. Sophia had already chosen. The question was whether the adults would be brave enough to fight for the family she had asked for in her letter to Santa Claus. But before they could make any decision, Carla's phone rang again. It was Mrs. Rose, her voice agitated on the other end of the line. "Carla, honey, I need to tell you something. I found out who made that report to CPS, and you're not going to believe it. It was Dr. Henry's ex-wife, the head of the department where you worked at the hospital," Mrs. Rose revealed, her voice filled with indignation. "Sylvia. She found out her husband was having an affair with one of the nurses and decided to get revenge by having you fired over that old story about the diapers. When she heard you were doing well again, she got furious and made the report to CPS." Carla was silent for a long moment, processing the information. Edward saw anger and relief mix on her face, anger at being the victim of a petty revenge, relief at discovering it wasn't paranoia. "How did you find out?" Carla asked. "Sylvia herself confessed, drunk, at the hair salon yesterday. She was bragging about putting a gold digger in her place," Mrs. Rose replied with contempt. "I recorded the whole thing on my phone. I can send you the audio." After hanging up, Carla turned to Edward, her emotions on a roller coaster. "At least now we know we're not crazy. Someone really was trying to hurt us." "Does this change anything?" Edward asked. "CPS is still coming back." "It changes everything," Carla replied, a new determination shining in her eyes. "Because now I know I'm not a negligent mother being justly investigated. I'm a mother being harassed by a vengeful woman." Edward watched the transformation in Carla. For the first time since he'd met her, she seemed truly strong, not just resilient. The difference was subtle, but fundamental. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Fight," Carla answered without hesitation. "Fight for Sophia, for us, for this strange family we've somehow built." "Us?" Carla looked at Sophia, still asleep. In her arms, then at Edward. 3 weeks ago I would have said family was just me and Sophia, but looking at her now, hearing her whisper your name in her sleep, seeing how she lights up when you arrive, I realize family isn't just blood. It's who chooses to stay, who fights for you, who loves you unconditionally. Edward felt tears burn his eyes. "Carla." "No," she interrupted him. "Let me finish. You came into our lives in a completely crazy way. Did absurd things like buying an entire city block to give me a job, offered me marriage, as a solution to a bureaucratic problem. Any sane person would say you're nuts." Edward laughed nervously. "And are you going to say that?" "I'm going to say you're nuts," Carla confirmed, but her smile softened the words. "But it's the right kind of crazy. The crazy of someone who loves without calculating the consequences, who cares more about the well-being of others than their own emotional safety." "So?" Carla took a deep breath, as if preparing to jump off a cliff. "So yes. Yes to the marriage. Yes to trying to be a family. Yes to building something real. Together." Edward felt as if the world had stopped spinning. "Are you sure?" "I'm scared," Carla admitted. "But I'm sure. Sophia deserves a complete family, and I deserve a chance to be happy. To trust someone again." Edward knelt before her, taking her free hands as she held Sophia. "I promise I will earn that trust, every day, for the rest of my life." "And I promise I'll try not to be so afraid of being loved," Carla replied. "Sophia taught me that sometimes it's worth taking risks for impossible dreams." A week later, Edward and Carla were married, in a simple ceremony at City Hall, with Sophia as the sole witness and maid of honor. The little girl wore a white dress Edward had bought especially for the occasion and carried a small bouquet of daisies, her favorite flowers. "Are you really married now?" Sophia asked as they left the courthouse. "We are," Edward answered, picking her up. "And can I call you Daddy?" Edward felt his throat tighten with emotion. You can, if you want to. Daddy, Sophia tested the word, then smiled radiantly. Daddy, 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 now I have a family just like the kids at school. When the social workers returned the following week, they found a completely different situation. Edward and Carla were legally married, had proven financial stability, and Sophia was clearly living in a loving and secure environment. The audio Mrs. Rose had recorded also helped explain the motivations behind the initial report. Apparently there was a misunderstanding, Ms. Marshall admitted, reviewing the paperwork. Sophia's situation seems to be well resolved. Ms. Fernandez, though more reluctant, also had to agree. The marriage certainly provides the stability we were looking for. We see no need for further monitoring. After the social workers left, this time for good, the small family gathered in the living room. Sophia was playing on the floor, surrounded by new toys Edward had bought, but clearly more interested in the cardboard boxes they came in. Do you have any regrets? Carla asked, watching Edward help Sophia build a cardboard fort. About what? About everything. The whirlwind wedding, taking on a ready-made family, having your life turned upside down because of a letter that arrived by mistake. Edward stopped building the fort and looked at her. You know what's funny? That letter didn't arrive by mistake. What do you mean? Mrs. Miller confessed yesterday. She saw that you lived in the same neighborhood as her niece, recognized the child's handwriting, and decided to give it to me because she thought I needed to be humanized. Edward laughed. She said she'd been trying to find me a family for years. Carla's jaw dropped. So she knew the whole time. She knew. And when I told her about the wedding, she cried with joy and said it was the best thing she'd ever done in her life. Daddy, Sophia called, interrupting the conversation. The fort is ready. Come live in here with me. Edward and Carla looked at each other and laughed. Together they squeezed into the small cardboard structure, Sophia between them, all cramped but happy. It's small, Sophia observed, but it fits everyone I love. 6 months later, the house Edward had bought especially for the family was full of life. The backyard had a swing set he had installed for Sophia. The kitchen always smelled of the home-cooked meals Carla prepared with love, and the walls were covered with photos and children's drawings. Edward had discovered that being a father was nothing like he had imagined. It was harder, more tiring, more frustrating, and infinitely more rewarding. Sophia woke him up too early on weekends, asked impossible questions, and demanded constant attention, and he wouldn't trade a second of this life for all the organized solitude he had before. Carla had blossomed in ways Edward hadn't expected. Without the constant pressure of financial survival, she relaxed, laughed more, and allowed herself to dream about the future. She went back to school at night, studying business administration, with plans to become a partner in Edward's company. You know what I realized? Carla said one night as they watched Sophia sleep in her new princess bed. What? That love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about choosing someone imperfect and deciding to build something beautiful together, even when it's hard. Edward hugged her, pulling her closer. And would you choose me again, knowing everything you know now? Every single day, Carla answered without hesitation. You and your beautiful craziness that turned a child's letter into a real family. The next morning, Sophia woke them up early, jumping on the bed with a piece of paper in her hand. Look, I made another letter for Santa Claus. Edward and Carla looked at each other, amused. And what did you ask for this time? Carla asked. Sophia opened the paper and read carefully. Dear Santa Claus, thank you for giving me the best daddy and the best family in the world. This year I don't want anything. I just want other kids to be as lucky as I was. I want them to find their families too. Love, Sophia Stanton. Edward felt tears roll down his face. Sophia had taken his last name without anyone asking, making official in her heart what was already official on paper. Sophia Stanton sounds beautiful, Carla observed, wiping her own eyes. It sounds like family, Edward agreed. And as the three of them hugged on the messy bed surrounded by pillows and blankets, with the sunlight streaming through the window and illuminating their smiling faces, Edward knew he had found much more than a family. He had found the true meaning of home, not a place but the people who choose to stay by your side no matter what. The letter from a 4-year-old girl had done much more than give him a family. It had taught him that the best gifts in life can't be bought, they can only be built. With love, patience, and the courage to believe in happy endings, even when they seem impossible. And on that sunny morning, holding the 2 most important people in his life, Edward finally understood the true miracle of Christmas. It wasn't in the magic of an old man with a white beard, but in the human capacity to turn love into family, dreams into reality, and loneliness into belonging. The life they had built together wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was more than enough.